The reasons for the Chinese interest in Africa are not the Chinese interest in Africa and the New Year's, but rather to the era of the 50s of the last century, specifically with the beginning of the inauguration of the non-alignment bloc since the Bandung Conference in 1956, in which Egypt and 6 other African countries participated, and Egypt was one of the first countries to recognize China. The Chinese interest in Africa at that time was due to a political, basic consideration related to securing Beijing's obtaining the support of African countries to recognize it in the face of the government of Viruza Taiwan and the government of China to consider the only legitimate representative of the people. Since this time, several considerations of the Chinese trend towards Africa have crystallized, some of which are economic, other political, as well as population and cultural considerations. With regard to political considerations, it is noted that there are 2 main considerations in this regard. The first, withdrawing more African support for Taiwan, and the consideration of the One China principle is the ruling basis in this regard, but rather the criterion of dealing with or against African countries. This interest has emerged clearly since the 1960s after the African countries' vote within the United Nations General Assembly in 1963 showed that 17 countries were supported by Taiwan compared to 14 countries for China. However, this percentage was a lot after that. In 1971, Beijing obtained the support of 26 African countries over its entitlement to the permanent seat of the Security Council. In 1975, 37 African countries recognized it for only 8 for Taiwan. Since the 1990s, China has raised the principle of One China in dealing with African countries, and has worked to use the economic aid paper in this regard, and has succeeded in withdrawing the recognition of 6 countries in Taiwan, Central Africa, Guinea, Bissau, Niger, Lesotho, South Africa, then Liberia in 2003, before the deployment of Chinese army forces to help implement water projects in the country, and now the number of African countries that recognize Taiwan has declined to only 4 countries, Burkina Faso, Sotomi, Bursep, Gambia, and Swaziland. As for the second consideration, it is China's desire to obtain African support in international forums such as the United Nations and others, especially with regard to the human rights file in China, which is one of the thorny issues in China-American relations, especially within the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and it also wants to have a crowd in African is a great diplomatic support for it in any possible confrontation with the major countries, whether within the United Nations or the Security Council. This Chinese orientation is due to several reasons, the most important of which is to face the problem of population increase on the one hand, and to face the problem of lack of natural resources on the other hand. This vision was translated by the Chinese government in practice during the recent times, as it has intensified the volume of its trade exchange with Africa to increase from $11 billion in 2000 to $73 billion in 2007. With the high prices of raw materials before the last global financial crisis in November 2008, China became larger investor in Africa and the third trading partner after the United States and France. In the beginning of 2008, there were 800 Chinese government companies investing in the continent, and these companies spent $6 billion in 900 private projects in the raw materials sector. This accelerated Chinese expansion in Africa appears clear to those who wander around the 53rd countries where it can see the red Chinese flag in many parts of the continent, as well as the embassies spread here and there, 49 countries, and there has also been a new Chinese elite present in several countries on the continent cherishes with its customs and traditions, whether in terms of food or clothing, but there are almost some of the cities who have been reserved only by Chinese. In many countries of the continent, some of them are almost limited to the Chinese, where there are special gates, as well as the provision of Chinese foods in restaurants in them, and it is not allowed for non-Chinese to enter, and it is noted that African roads are filled with cheap Chinese cars and buses, which transport citizens to Chinese stores with low prices. And the railways that were created by the Beijing government travel large distances throughout the continent, as well as their connection to ports on the seas in order to carry the raw materials to Beijing, compared to the goods loaded from China to Africa such as children's toys. This heavy Chinese expansion in Africa raises several questions that this study tries to address, which are the reasons and goals of Chinese interest in Africa. What are the Chinese principles governing the relationship with Africa? Is the Chinese role in the continent a complement to Western countries or a competitor to it? The principles and determinants of the Chinese relationship with Africa. The China worked to benefit from the bitter experience that African countries have gone through with the colonial countries and the major countries such as the United States, whether this is before or after independence, and then formulated a set of principles specified for their relations with Africa, which may make it more acceptance not only African elites, but also for African peoples. Among the most important of these principles and determinants, one emphasizing that China represents a different pattern and independent of other major powers in the international ocean, especially given that it is a developing country that understands Africa's development needs, as well as being eligible to defend the interests of the continent in international forums. 2. Focus on cooperation and economic investment with African countries that do not have the acceptance of the West, such as Sudan, Zimbabwe, and Angola. 3. Not to interfere in the internal affairs of African countries, even if these countries violate human rights. The Chinese principle in this regard is what the Chinese Deputy Foreign Minister, Zhu Wenong, who indicated that dealing with Africa relates to practical aspects and not human rights. Trade is a trade, and Beijing will not interfere in internal affairs where we try to separate trade and politics. For emphasis, however, relations with Africa aim to achieve profit and mutual benefit for both sides. 5. Mutual support and coordination within multilateral organizations, including the United Nations, to support fair demands for the other party. 6. The diversity of relations in all fields and not limiting them to the economic or commercial side only. 7. Emphasizing the principle of one China. Hence, it is noticed that China is keen on the absence of political conditions for its relations with Africa, especially in the field of providing loans and grants, as well as it rejects the Western method based on benefiting without benefiting, in addition to the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, which was one of the main problems in African international relations, where the African countries accused the major countries of interfering without right to their internal affairs. Perhaps this is a kind of Chinese intelligence that made it win investment contracts in countries that do not have international acceptance such as Sudan and Angola, which is, with regard to economic considerations, they are many, the most prominent of which are the following. 1. Chinese desire to obtain oil and other natural resources from Africa, especially wood and cotton that are used in the textile industry, especially since the large industrial revolution that China witnessed made it, despite its production of oil, an imported country for it since 1993. By 2004 China became the second largest oil consumer after the United States, and this consumption is expected to increase annually by 10%. This means that if Beijing imports a third of its oil and gas needs now, this percentage will reach 60% by 2010. Given that the Asian oil does not fulfill its needs, and that the Middle East oil is acquired by the United States and European countries, China is looking for other sources, and has found its desired way in African oil, as it is now obtaining 25% of its oil needs from the continent. 6. And there are 7 African countries that provide Beijing in this percentage, namely Algeria, Sudan, Chad, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Angola and Nigeria, as it imports 70% of its wooden needs of African forests, as well as importing large amounts of iron and platinum from Zimbabwe and South Africa. 2. The large size of the African market to market Chinese products, as the size of this market is 900 million, and then China became the third trade partner for Africa after the United States and France, although the size of Chinese trade with Africa is still limited, as it only constitutes 1% of the total China's foreign trade size. But this exchange is witnessing an improvement from year to year. According to the data of the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, the trade volume increased from $40 billion in 2005 to $106.8 billion in 2008, an increase of more than 250%, while the rate was $1 billion only in 1999. In other words, the ruling on Chinese trade with Africa increased by more than 50 times in just 9 years, 1999 to 2008. As for population considerations, it is related to the large increase in the size of the population in China, with a population of 500 million people to 1.3 billion people in just 50 years, and therefore there was a need to discuss the settlement of these in separate places of the world, among them Africa, which many Chinese leaders considered a country belonging to Beijing through the idea of resettlement of the Chinese on this continent, especially since this idea is old, and that the resettlement of these Chinese on the continent and their mating from Africans so that there are Chinese descendants that replace the bad African Negro race from their point of view. Therefore, a strategic goal has been set by Beijing officials that 300 million Chinese are needed in Africa to solve the problem of population and pollution, especially since the number of Chinese settlers on the continent does not exceed 750,000 people. On the fourth side, cultural considerations are an important factor. There is a Chinese desire to spread the Confucianism culture in many African countries, especially the beloved countries such as Rwanda and Burundi. It is noted that some of these previous considerations may be more important in some cases than others, such as political considerations at the beginning of the relationship, than the predominance of economic considerations has become, while not ignoring population and cultural considerations. If the British were our professors yesterday, then the Chinese took their place today. With these brief words, Trefor Nkopi, one of the largest Chinese businessmen in Africa, expressed his country's vision of the brown continent, as the goal for them is to have economic control over it just as the British Empire was dominated during the colonial era, which is the same idea that dominates the thought Chinese rulers and leaders who want to make Africa as a whole as a country belonging to Beijing.